Whiteman is a historian of late imperial China, whose work focuses on Qing imperial culture, material practices, and the political meanings of landscape mapping and place. His research bridges multiple fields, including, of course, art history, but also legal administrative history, and as we will learn, digital humanities as well. On the analog humanities side, we might say, he's also the author and editor of numerous books. I commend to you in particular his study of the Chungdong mountain resort entitled The Kangxi Emperor and His Estate at Ruhe, which was published in 2020 by the University of Washington Press. On the digital front, he's also been involved in several projects concerned with mapping, spatial construction, and the perception of space and environment in early modern architecture and art. And in that vein, he will be speaking to us today on the topic of the virtual mountain estate project, extended reality, and the remediation of an early modern Chinese landscape. So, Professor Whiteman, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you for this invitation. You can hear me okay, everybody?
Perfectly.
Great. And thank you to Baz Maluk and to everybody at the CUHK Research Institute for the Humanities for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be here today to speak about a current project, which, as Professor McManus said, builds on a lot of the work that I'm doing, that I have done in the past. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you in person. I will be back in Hong Kong in late June and really looking forward to that visit, though maybe not to the heat. And maybe we'll have a chance to speak to some of you at that time. I will be in that visit at HKU primarily, but I'm hoping in another capacity, so I'm just sort of promoting this here, to be running a workshop on publishing in art history journals. And because in another role, I am the editor of an art history journal. And so please do reach out if that's of interest to you. Now that I've spruiked that sideline. Oh, I guess I could put up my slides. That would help, wouldn't it? Share. This is what I want. This is what I want. And this is what okay. Continue to share this. Yes, continue to share this. Sorry. So now everybody can see a covering slide. Sorry, I should have given this to you earlier. I will say, as a bit of a preface, this is work that I'm actively writing up at the moment, and that my collaborators and I, who I will mention in a few minutes, are in the process of building into a digital publication, which I'll tell you about more. And so I really look forward to questions and the opportunity to discuss this as we go forward. All right, let's see if we can kill the slides to go forward. No, we can't. Okay, there we go. In 1712, the Qing Kangxi Emperor marked the completion of his Inner Mongolian imperial park palace, Bishu Shanzhuang, by designating 36 sites of particularly concentrated scenic significance. Each scene, or jing, was marked on the building from which it was intended to be experienced through a calligraphed name board, or biena, hung over the entrance, its 4-character title carved in the emperor's hand. The visitor's experience of the jing was further framed by a poetic couplet mounted on a pair of pillars at the entrance or somewhere within the hall. The jing itself was not the hall, or even the view from the hall, though both the architecture and its visual surroundings played key roles in its constitution. Rather, the jing consisted of a multifaceted, culturally mediated, sensory and imaginative experience consisting of the immediate physical surroundings, literary and mnemonic references, and the visitor's individual intellectual and emotional responses. The gardens jing were appreciated primarily by the emperor and his court, though, as an account of an imperially led tour by the senior minister Zhang Yushu attests, they also figured prominently in the itineraries and experiences of the emperor's seasonal guests. In 1714, the scenes were extended. Scenes were extended materially and conceptually through a court publication that combined views of the Qing with imperial texts, a short prose preface describing the scene's physical location, and an annotated poem describing the emperor's own intellectual and emotional response to the scene in terms that combine the political and the personal. I've gotten behind, sorry. Based on a painted original by the court artist Wang Yanqi, now lost, or actually, apparently, perhaps in the Guangzhou Museum of Fine Arts, I recently learned. They have an album that they claim to be the Wang Yanqi album. The printed scenes created an alternative space for experiencing the garden's Qing, once distinct from and in dialogue with the experience of the original landscape, available to a wider, though still elite audience through the act of reading a book. Thus, the experience of Qing was not just multifaceted, but also constituted across multiple spaces, times, media, and audiences, combining culturally mediated stimuli with subjective, if not wholly individual, responses. I've begun by discussing a series of linked objects, garden, pavilion, painting album, printed book, which themselves describe a series of linked spaces. My focus this morning, or this afternoon for you, is not so much those objects and spaces, however, but upon the historicized experience of them, and with it, the question of considering experience as an art historical object. Obviously, it is not possible to understand experience independent of the spaces in which it occurs or the media that shape it. The landscape objects with which we've begun and the Qing that they simultaneously shape and record are intimately intertwined. My current project, and the subject of my talk today, the virtual mountain estate, explores the experience of Qing, its interconnection with and across media, and more broadly, the prospects and problematics of interactive digital environments for researching and writing an art history of experience. Can we make experience itself the object of our study? And if so, what is our question? Experience is multivalent, subjective, and above all, ephemeral. Our experience of the built environment, designed landscapes, and the world at large is highly mediated and contingent, connected to both individual perspectives and cultural framing. It is, moreover, a subject that lies at the complex intersection of the humanities and sciences, as the senses, emotions, perception, and memory incorporate objective and subjective elements of cognition. What contributes to our experience of a site or a space? How do textual, visual, spatial, and cognitive elements interact to create experience? What sources can help reconstruct that experience? How does experience change across different cultural contexts and over time? And how should our methods change in response? And finally, and perhaps most appropriately for this audience, can digital tools such as mapping, 3D modeling, or augmented reality aid our understanding of experience? The virtual mountain estate explores subjective embodied experience of landscape in early modern China through the imperial garden of Bishu shanzhuang. It seeks not just to describe what the experience would have been for an educated 18th century visitor to the emperor's park palace, as a conventional scholarly text might do, and indeed, as Professor McManus mentioned, my first book did, but to offer a critically constructed model of that experience in the form of interactive, immersive environments for direct engagement by the reader-visitor. Combining extended reality in various forms with different textual supports and publishing formats, it offers an approach to art history in which the medium of presentation is integral to the argument and in dialogue with the project's sources. In so doing, the virtual mountain estate illuminates the multivalent, transmediated nature of landscape experience in pre-modern China, while offering insight into hidden histories hidden by layers of history and historiography. More broadly, it argues for the cultural situatedness of experience and for the necessity, particularly in the case of digital approaches, of methods and tools that are rooted in the local rather than universalized. Before I continue, I want to pause and acknowledge my collaborators on the virtual mountain estate. They include my colleague, Dr. Hedron Sum, a specialist in digital humanities and data management at the National University Singapore. Our project researchers, Shiyong Fang and He Jin Yao, who are both PhD students working on the Qing court. Bishu Dhanapalan, a Mumbai-based filmmaker and now teaching at DePaul University in Chicago, who built the initial models and workflows for the scenes, as well as Amber Chan and Joseph Cho, who continued his work. And finally, Vanessa Ang, who is building the VR and AR environments I'm going to share. And Marnie Williams and Katrina Grant of Power Publications in Sydney, who are leading on design of the innovative digital and print publications for the project, which I'll mention later. Projects such as this are, as you well know, iterative and experimental, require both creativity and a level of comfort with uncertain outcomes, and thrive through mutually generative collaboration. I want to express my great gratitude for the remarkable team of which I'm a part. Oops, there they are, sorry. Clearly my slides are a little off today. Built between 1702 and 1712 by the Kangxi Emperor, Bishu Shanzhuang is a roughly 1,400-acre imperial park palace located in the modern city of Chengde, Hebei province. It served as a seasonal retreat and base camp for the intertwined activities of hunting, feasting, and diplomacy, allowing the emperor and his court to escape the heat and disease of Beijing summer for the cooler breezes and open land of Inner Mongolia. In its early years under Kangxi, the site was dotted with several hundred individual buildings and courtyard complexes, including residential and audience halls, theaters, temples, boathouses, and pavilions for enjoying the scenery. While some served relatively public functions, such as conducting government business or entertaining visiting officials and dignitaries, from the descriptions of the Neapolitan missionary Matteo Ripa, who visited on a number of occasions, we know that many were reserved for the pleasure of the emperor, female attendants, and perhaps a few privileged guests. The emperor's 36 scenes were thus first and foremost environments for his own experience, spaces in which he read, worked, meditated, or relaxed, and through which his experience was formed in response to the multifaceted sensory and intellectual inputs that shaped the Qing. That experience was both exclusive and ephemeral. While the architectural and environmental settings and literary framing in the form of nameboards and poetic couplets were relatively fixed, the visitor's experience changed in relationship to their individual engagement with a culturally mediated scene. In composing text describing the scenes and his responses to them, and ordering their printed compilation together with images, the emperor at once solidified and extended access to the experience of the Qing. Popular compilations of famous sites have a long history in China, dating at least to the Song, when cultural itineraries such as the 8 views of the Xiao and Xiang rivers and the 10 views of West Lake were commemorated in poetic cycles and paired with images in image text dyads, or tuyong. By the 16th century, these circulated widely through painting and print, helping to create a shared response to the sites among cultured visitors and readers. The same period saw the commemoration of private gardens of literati elite through similar media. The Kangxi Emperor's imperial poems marks an innovation, however, an unprecedented sharing of imperial space and experience with a wider audience through visual media. To better understand this transition from physical site to printed environment, we need to first understand the reading process, the process of visual touring, so to speak, shaped by the materiality and content of the book. So the book, as you can see in the lower left, and we're looking actually at in that particular image, at a Qianlong reprint of the Kangxi book, consists of, as I say, 36 scenes, and they combine text first and then image. The text, it consists of is ostensibly, and presumably really was, written by the emperor, perhaps with help of officials. But it consists of 2 parts. The first is a prose preface, And then the second is a short poem. So in the case of the scene that we're looking at on the right, which is Sounds of a Spring Near and Far, or Yanjing Qianshan, we start with a prose preface that physically situates the site within the garden. To the north is in the north is Leaping Spring, which is the name of a spring that you can hear from this site. It describes the sound it has. And then to the west, there is, which is sort of off to the left as you look north, you can't see it in this photo, is a waterfall. It descends from actually you can see it maybe in this, in the print in the lower left. If you see this cliff sort of on the left side of the composition, there's a waterfall coming down that. Okay, so there's a waterfall. It describes how that waterfall appears. It describes the environment. There are light winds that go and they disperse water in the air. So you can imagine that it's a cool environment in which you can see this cascade of water and you can hear the sound of other water. And then beyond, there are ponds filled with lotuses, which smell in a certain way. And in the spring, it's just like you're in this scene on Hermitage Mountain. Okay, so he's physically described the site and sort of compared it to a famous location elsewhere in China, linking Bishu Shanzhuang out to the larger cultural landscape. And then he goes on to give a short poem. And that poem it takes the physical landscape as its start, but it compares it in a variety of ways to different scenes, to different historical contexts, such as Taoist poetry in this case, or other types of hermetic retreats, which is what he's describing out here. Here he's saying that by being transported away from the sort of everyday reality of rule, and particularly of Beijing, I have a chance to sort of meditate and raise my inner spirit so that I'm a better ruler. In other places, he talks about various types of intellectual discourse around proper ways to rule, or around other types of meditation and self-care of his health and his mental well-being. And the major themes of these poems are two. The first is that by retreating, he is from Beijing to Chengde in this landscape, he is able to take care of himself, and therefore he's in better health to do a better job ruling. And the second is creating a variety of moral or ethical links between the landscape and various moral values. And so certain flowers inspire certain types of behavior, certain sounds or certain memories or certain associations cause certain ideas to be developed in his mind. And again, all of these help him be a better ruler. And so this is a landscape of sort of morality and ethics, of right rulership and self-care in essence. So, and each scene has a slightly different theme, but this is basically what they run on. So one starts in reading the book much like you would start when you enter the building that is the setting for the landscape. You start with a text. With the building, you start with the bianme and the couplet on the side of the door that then frames your experience as you then go into the physical environment or the prepared environment. In the book, you begin with the emperor's words that helps you imaginatively navigate the garden and then understand how he experiences the scene or understands or interprets the scene that you're about to witness. Following the text, you then open up the scene. And unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of the book with me, but you can see here it actually appears to be bound in the middle, but that's actually the binding of the book from which I took this photograph. You can see that the scene opens in a sort of double wide fashion. Whereas normally prints, two-page prints in China are bound in essence like this one is down the middle. And so a double wide picture would have a sort of gutter in which it was broken up. This book is, in the Kangxi period, is bound in a way that I think has no precedent in China, or no precedent that I've seen, and maybe someone can correct me, which is to say that the print is double wide. So like if each of my hands is half a page, it's double wide, and it's bound along one edge, and then it's folded into the book. And so when you encounter it after you read the text, at first you can't see the image at all. It's just the back of the page. And then, then you open it up like this, and you get this sort of panoramic, unbroken, double wide view of the scene. That you can then enjoy. And without the binding, I think that probably helps you sort of enter imaginatively into the scene to wander or roam around the garden in your mind. But roaming around the garden in your mind, all with the emperor's words, with the emperor's framing of it operating in your head. This sort of combination is really important, both for how one can experience it remotely, a sense that the emperor has shared this with you, but isn't himself present in the scenes, and so he's not sort of displacing you from it. Rather, he, in some sense, is sitting next to you, looking at this album. Perhaps the words are him describing it to you. There is a sort of imaginative leap that makes this space available for the reader. And this book would have been distributed as a present, probably for the emperor's 60th birthday in 1712, to a variety of imperial and bureaucratic elites. So members of the imperial clan, senior officials in court very senior officials might have received a copy of a book like this. It was printed in Chinese and in Manchu. There were 400 copies of this version, of this woodblock version made. And so you can imagine it's a not tiny, but also not huge circle of people who are given this sort of invitation to visit a remediated version of the mediated landscape of Bishu Shanzhuang, most of whom, of course, would never have been there in real life, and in any case, would enjoy much greater access through the book, in the sense that it takes you around much of the garden as it existed under Kangxi, than they would have even if they had visited, in which their movements, in which their access would have been very circumscribed to areas relatively close to the entrance of the garden. As such, the Qing emerges from these various pieces as what we might think of as an experiential realm, a more or less specifically circumscribed, culturally mediated site that is framed in terms of an idealized experience encompassing season, time, weather, actions, poetics, and thoughts. While in principle, this realm is a physical space situated in the real world, the experience of it is one that exists between spaces and across media, drawing on direct and remembered encounters remediated across and between versions of the landscape. Part 2, the model is the argument. In her 2013 article, Is There a Digital Art History?, Johanna Drucker writes that, quote, the ways of thinking about works of art that arise from digital methods, close quote, allow fresh consideration of what constitutes an art historical object and opens the door to new research questions. In Drucker's term, the digital, as distinct from the digitized, constitutes ways of thinking with digital processes. She continues, quote, what is the object? It becomes the effect of those processes, constituted by the integration of information and not by a static object merely perceived as such. Dynamic queries reconfigure an object through inquiry and along lines of analysis that are multifaceted, not literal or reductive, close quote. These results and she goes on to say, these results and others generated through analytic techniques are not endpoints, but rather starting points for thinking about art history and its objects. Drucker's argument raises two interrelated ideas on which the virtual mountain estate is built. The first is that in taking an experience, not just the environment perceived, but the perception itself, as our art historical object, the digital and specifically immersive modeling allows us to create an object, we might say a surrogate, that can be subjected to critical engagement and analysis. And second, that the process of creating that model, the research that informs it, the inferences and conclusions that are drawn based on that data, and the model itself, made available for reading, should be understood as a process akin to writing, the model constituting an argument about the historical material it explores. And I just say as an aside, this is, you may all be familiar with Drucker's article, but this is this equation between writing and building is one that she primarily focuses on and others have focused on through the idea of the database as something that has an argument, which of course we would all now find quite familiar. And so basically what I'm trying to say is here, the models that I'm showing you also have an argument, just as that even though they have a database sitting behind them as well, they also are an argument. My earlier research on Bishu shanzhuang focused on the construction and articulation of imperial identity through landscape, both the physical garden as a stage for imperial performance and the visual, textual, and mnemonic rhetorics that situated it within broader 18th century discourses of landscape and authority. Using GIS as a tool for critical visualization through mapping, I reconstructed the built environment and its occupation under Kangxi and explored possibilities of understanding embodied experience, such as movement through the landscape via touring or traveling by boat. In these two maps, we see some of the arguments built from this work. On the left, a map showing the route by which Kangxi led the aforementioned Zhang Yushu and others through the garden in 1708, highlighting sites visited, those mentioned but not seen, and those lying outside the tour's itinerary, and suggesting different levels of access and exclusivity within the garden. And on the right, a map built around extant evidence of boat landings throughout the Central Lakes area that illustrates potential rather than explicitly documented journeys by water, and argues for the significance of water in movement through the site. In each case, the process of mapping was integral to the discovery of hidden formations within the landscape, while the maps themselves serve both as visualization that demonstrate the argument and as surrogates for the site that can be analyzed and critiqued in their own rights. The virtual mountain estate builds on this work by using thick modeling of subjective experience to critically interrogate that experience. The models or scenes at the heart of the project interrogate the multifaceted simultaneity of experience, which combines the physical environment, sensory stimuli, and cultural memory in the form of reference to literary and landscape traditions. It also models the embodied nature of that experience, including movement through space, spatial dynamics of the physical environment, the physical and sensory stimuli, and emotional response processes by which landscape was poetically and mnemonically framed. The virtual mountain estate consists of 3 of Kangxi's 36 scenes, originally selected for the variety of experiences they offered. All were situated on Rui Island, the largest of the islands at the heart of Bishu shanzhuang. Set at dawn, Xiling Chenxia, or morning mist on the western ridge, emphasizes the light of the rising sun, which illuminates mist on the lake, making a rainbow effect that evokes the thoughts of sacred peaks. These lands of the immortals aid the emperor in cultivating his inner being, which in turn make him a better ruler. Jinyan Yinre, or golden lotuses reflecting the sun, focuses on the play of the afternoon sun on a field of dryland lotus. Viewed from the upper story of a hall, the light adds to an illusion of depth and space, making the field appear much larger than it is. This, in turn, highlights an evocation of the distant sacred peak, Wu Taishan, with which the flowers are associated. Finally, the very dark, sorry, I guess the moon is not in this model quite sufficiently. Finally, Yunfan Yuefang, or moon boats with cloud sails, is set at night. in a boat-shaped hall standing along the western shore of Rui Island near Xiling Chenxia. The proximity to the water, coupled with a viewpoint from the upper story, creates the illusion that the hall is a boat floating in the sky, sailing to the moon. The poem accompanying the scene is set to music, which the visitor hears floating up from the ground floor as though played by a distant musician. And I will say, I'm not going, I don't believe, to speak about it, but but when that music, when this is published, hopefully later this year or early next, or if you're able to visit an exhibition, of which I'll tell you more about, in which this is, the music is incredibly cool. The poems, all, as you will know from Chinese poetry, often indicate what pattern they are, what rhyme pattern or what type of poem they are. And this poem, uniquely among the 36, is one that indicates that it was set to music. And that music was unknown. And in my previous research, I'd never given it any thought. But Xi Yongfang, who is one of the PhD students working on this project, and is, among other things, herself a classically trained musician, went off and found the sheet music for this in the Qing archives, in a Qing publication, court publication of court music, and then engaged friends, colleagues of hers in Taiwan who are musicians to perform the music. And so we have the poem sung and performed by these performers, which I think is sort of the first time I heard this, sort of after, what feels to me like it must have been 300 years of silence, was quite amazing. I think it's very cool. Anyway, with that, I would like to now share with you the first of our three models, Morning Mist Along the Western Ridge. What I'm going to show is not yet an interactive model, or in this case, it's not an interactive model. It is a recording of the walkthrough of the model in its game engine, which is Unreal, with mock-ups of the interactive elements in order to allow you to see how it will work and what sort of experience it aims to provide. But I should say that in at least some contexts, which is to say in exhibitions, this is being built as a VR. And so the idea is that in exhibition or in teaching, or in your own enjoyment, you will be able to operate this, at least operate the interactive parts, which you'll see in a moment, yourself in a fully immersive environment. The web publication will probably be done by recording, simply because of compatibility problems. Okay, so now if you will excuse me, I'm going to have to switch, I hope, to another scene. Can you now just see a black screen? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. There is sound. I hope it will not be too loud for you, but just as a warning, it's not unpleasant sound, I hope, but it may be loud, is all I mean. So you'll start here. You'll have a choice of scenes with which you enter. You can choose any of the three, though there is, as I say, a morning, noon, afternoon, and nighttime one. You have selected morning.
西里晨霞，雨歇更阑斗柄东。晨霞聚散四方风，时光岂在凌云聚。寡过金坛以手中。
So now having heard the poem, we now see the preface. It's important here that we tie a very close connection for the viewer between the material text, the book that we are remediating, as well as the site, and our remediation in the form of the VR. The different points of text are highlighted as you prove through it, so that you can see exactly how you're progressing through the text into this as you move through the space. Now you come to the sort of culminating point of the experience itself. So we bring out the poem. We shift from the preface to the poem, where you can experience what the emperor hopes you to see. Discover more panels help explain the text so that you understand as a original viewer might have. And then when you're finished, you're drawn back out and you would return to the main menu where you could choose another scene. Okay. Now let me go back and try to do this again. Sorry. Okay. Continue. Now we're back to my slides. Is that right for everybody? None of the three structures survives today, adding both challenges to the process of reconstruction and an opportunity in their recreation. The landscape and architecture of the scenes are modeled based on Qing period images and archival records in contemporary fieldwork and satellite-based data. The interiors are drawn from later archival documents and surviving works in mostly Chinese collections intended to create what we call plausible fictions to fill the gaps in our Kangxi period knowledge. And here, having mentioned Yongfang earlier, I want to just mention the PhD student who is responsible for this work, He Junyao, who has used the Qing furnishing archives, developed a method to use the Qing furnishing archives of the Chenshidang to not only identify objects, or at least types of objects that would have been interiors, but to reconstruct the internal layout of buildings and the arrangement of that furniture within the building. And so while it's not precise, while it's not absolutely 100% accurate or precise, these are remarkably effective reconstructions of where internal pillars, internal walls, major pieces of furniture must have been situated. And you can see how he does this in this working document, where he is clearly taking notes, where he's trying to figure out, well, there must be something here, there can't be something there, there's got to be a door, there's a throne has got to sit here, etc., etc., which then leads to the ways in which our interiors are constructed. I will say these are both my grad students, and I'm very, very proud of their work. I think it's really wonderful stuff. The experiences themselves are rooted in the emperor's words, the imperial poems described above, which, as we've seen, provide important information about the spatial dynamics, sensory stimuli, and emotional responses that the emperor wished to foreground. These, in turn, inform a data ontology, or system for organizing information for use in the database, that stands behind the models, that centers Chinese modes of understanding experience. And this is something, this is the work of He-Jun Sum, and my co-lead, and is something that we can absolutely discuss more in Q&A. As would have been the case for an 18th century viewer, the imperial texts are prescriptive, but not proscriptive, which is to say that they set the cultural terms of the extended experience, but also allow space for individual subjectivity. On the one hand, therefore, the models reflect Chinese understandings of experience. They are not free environments in which users can imagine their own experience, but remediations of a primary source which both describe and constitute the experience, which itself was a remediation of a primary Jing within the garden. On the other, the scenes take into account the ineffable variable of individual subjectivity by acknowledging and leaving room for the subjectivity of their modern user-visitor. In other words, they provide information necessary for that user-visitor to experience the scene on the same culturally literate terms that an 18th century reader of the emperor's book would have had, but to do so themselves rather than vicariously through an imagined or disembodied historical figure. This is the answer to the oft-asked question, why isn't there an emperor in this? Or why isn't there an official? Why isn't there a person that you move around as? This distinction is integral to both the ethical position of the project and its intellectual one, as we seek to truly explore the potential for immersive and interactive environments while resisting an inherent tendency in such digital spaces towards gamification. It is also central to our effort to articulate a decentered or Asia-centric mode of digital humanities, which too often relies on technologies, ways of thinking, and patterns of working that are fundamentally Eurocentric. Finally, I believe it offers an opportunity to critically reflect on the nature of the historical project as a whole, recognizing our own inevitable presence and that of our readers in the creation and reception of work. The medium is the message. The use of interactive and immersive media, in the first instance virtual reality, but also augmented reality and web-based models, advances the argument of the virtual mountain estate on two levels. In the first instance, the project aims to explore the potential for critical dialogue between argument and presentation, and the prospect that digital media offer alternatives to the linear narrative of a written text that comment productively and in self-reflexive manners on the argument itself. In other words, it proposes that the possibility that experiencing historical experience, or a model of it, will offer a qualitatively different form of understanding than reading about it can, as well as expanding engagement with the historical topic for a variety of audiences, including not only scholars, but also students and the interested public. Second, I would argue that extended reality, a term that encompasses virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies, is a medium in process of creation with parallels in the early modern, including early modern China. That virtuality and immersive experience were part of how Chinese painting over the longue durée was understood, that remediation was central to the processes by which cultural landscapes were articulated and encountered, and that both developed particular interest in applications in the Qing court. Virtuality and imaginative immersion is most evident in a variety of large-scale pictorial and spatial works employing various forms of accelerated perspective, particularly quadratura. These practices were introduced to the court by Giovanni Gherardini, an Italian missionary and follower of the Jesuit quadratisti Andrea Pozzo, who trained Qing court painters in European painting techniques, including perspective, around the turn of the 18th century. This massive screen, known now as Gentle Women in the Shade of a Paulownia Tree and attributed to Gherardini's studio, presents an encompassing view of the interior of two garden pavilions, within and around which stand several palace ladies. In the distance, a lake extends to low hills. Despite the depth of the composition, the vanishing point actually lies at the top center, which is to say, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Oh, I can't even see my cursor, so that doesn't work. But at the top of the roof, in the dead center of the building, is where the optical vanishing point lies. Drawing with the vanishing point actually lies at the top center, drawing the viewer's eyes and body up and into the scene, an illusion heightened by the short legs that elevate the screen above ground level, and the stairs leading to the pavilion at its center. The screen scale, coupled with its manner of display, it likely would have stood unarticulated, with the two end panels turned inwards at right angles for stability, or sitting on screen stands on either end, which would have allowed it to be presented in the way you see here, suggests a small three-sided enclosure. This would have furthered the image's illusionism. Scale and perspective thus combine to link the real space of the viewer, presumably the emperor, and the pictorial space of the screen, creating a form of immersive environment within its visual field. More literally immersive is the theater in Zhenqinzhai, the retirement pavilion of the Qianlong Emperor Kangxi's grandson. Built in the 1780s, it contains a literally immersive augmented reality in which virtual and real elements coexist. through a bamboo trellis fence that moves seamlessly from real to painted. And in the image on the left, you can see that 3/4 of it as it wraps around from the left to the right is real. And then the last little piece along the right is painted. Through a bamboo trellis fence that moves seamlessly from real to painted, a pictorial courtyard extends the space of the interior. At the center of the hall stands a stage, complete with a roof, as though it were outside. Standing before it, directly underneath a hanging cluster of grapes, the visitor occupies the ideal viewing position from which the perspective of the entire arbor and surrounding garden creates a holistic virtual environment, a technique drawn directly from Jesuit church ceilings. And if you've ever been in a late 17th or 18th century Jesuit church, 17th, not even late, 17th or 18th century Jesuit church, you will perhaps have experienced the painted domes or painted scenes on the ceiling that appear, in which the ceiling appears to open to the sky, or various types of things. This is what's called quadratura, and there is usually in Jesuit churches marked on the floor a tile that is or stone inlay that is the ideal viewing position. And if you stand there, then the illusion as you look up works perfectly. And then if you watch that illusion as you walk away, you'll watch the illusion fall apart, and you will see that it is actually just a painted flat, often flat or sometimes slightly curved ceiling. Both the Gentlewomen's Screen and the Drenching Theater draw on a number of 18th century interests, most particularly the interplay between the real and the fictional that appears in innumerable court and vernacular works, including the novel Dream of the Red Chamber, with its famous grand view garden, a world within a world that is home to several of the novel's protagonists. Aside from our own contemporary concerns about truth and falsity, this tension also underlines the blurring of distinctions between the present and the remembered, the embodied and the imposed, and between history and the present that are shared between the imperial poems and the virtual mountain estate. Oh, sorry, I had an image of exactly this from the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola in Rome by Andrea Pozzo, the man who taught Gherardini. So this is just a flat ceiling, despite, or maybe it's a curved ceiling. I've never actually been in this church, but you can see that it appears to open up to the sky when, of course, and the heaven, when, of course, it actually doesn't. Returning to the printed copy of the imperial poems, the book itself can be thought of in part as a virtualization of 36 specific Qing within the physical garden. It is more than that. In a very real sense, it co-creates the Qing with their physical iterations, neither standing entirely independent of the other. But it also creates a virtual space apart from Bishu shanzhuang itself, through which a reader-visitor may tour at will. This form of touring by book is heightened by the combination of the emperor's presence through his text and his absence within the images, which I mentioned earlier, as well as the printed work's material relation to the painted album upon which it is based. Album viewing is an immersive act, the small format of the paintings and the volume drawing the viewer across the picture plane and into the images. Such migration is already a feature of Chinese landscape painting, in which the viewer was expected to imaginatively pass into the painter's world to roam within the pictorial space. The absence of the emperor from the images aids this transgression, as the viewer is more easily able to enter a scene in which the emperor is not there to displace them. Viewing an album is also an intimate act, the small format being suitable for one or two people turning the leaves together. Here, too, the emperor's absence from within the images furthers the illusion, suggesting that he sits instead at the side of the reader. The text acting as his descriptions of the landscape as they move from scene to scene. A guided tour much like that provided to Zhang Yushu and many other imperial guests. The book, of course, is also accessible at will, unlike the garden, an ultimate mark of a virtual world, unhindered by the realities of access and opportunity. Like the transmediated environment of the imperial poems, the experience of the virtual mountain estate is created through the act of visiting or interactively engaging with the space. By navigating and interacting with the environment, the visitor produces a space in Lefebvrean terms, transforming it from a static model into a lived experience. This space is not a simulacrum of Bishu shanzhuang or even of the landscape of the imperial poems. Such a production would be impossible, even if it were desirable. Instead, it offers a surrogate that can be read against the sources, other treatments, and our own ways of understanding experience. Interrogating the multifaceted simultaneity of experience, it allows us to move through space, encounter sensory and literary inputs directly, and form our own responses to paraphysical and intellectual stimuli. This walking in the garden, to channel Michel Desserteau, who believed in learning about cities by walking through them, is at the heart of the critical dialogue between argument and presentation that is made through the virtual mountain estate, and central to what differentiates it from a conventional scholarly text. By adapting an unconventional medium to the needs of scholarly expression, the virtual mountain estate as a presentation of research invites productive and self-reflexive critique of the argument itself. To extend this point, I want to briefly outline the three formats in which the virtual mountain estate is being published or presented. And I recognize that short of the top line yellow shapes, that this is virtually illegible. Apologize for that. But this is a working mural board for the project. The first is through a peer-reviewed web publication into which the interactive models will be embedded, though, as I mentioned, probably as recordings because actual interactive VRs on a web page don't work. At least we haven't figured out how to make them work. The models will be accompanied by a number of essays by the research team discussing the historical context of the imperial poems, the poetics of Qing, and research methodologies, among other topics. There will also be a range of teaching tools to enable use of the site in primarily university classrooms. The web publication will emphasize transparency of data, meaning first that the models will include 4 versions of the textual annotations described above, annotated fly-throughs of architecture and furnishing, and other similar elements of scholarly citation. And second, that all the models, datasets, and other material underpinning the project will be available for engagement and reuse. The second version of the project will be a small book. It will be produced, printed book. It will be produced to evoke the imperial poems with a design imitating the unusual dimensions and materiality of the original. Inside, it will open with an essay introducing the project as a whole. This will be followed by the 3 scenes as they appear in the imperial publication. First, translations of the poems and annotations, then a fold-out reproduction of the image. Within this image will be a QR code. When the reader scans this with their phone or tablet, they will be taken to an AR version of the particular model they are viewing. This book, which we see as a more creative exploration of the questions of transmediality that animate the project, will also be available for download as a PDF through the web publication, and so can be used in classes or by other public readers. Finally, we are in discussion with a number of libraries and museums in Asia, Europe, and North America about a small series of exhibitions, each particular to their venue. At the heart of the exhibitions will be the VR versions of the scenes, presented either through goggles or in a collective environment, such as a cave. The remaining content of the exhibitions will vary by location, but may explore issues of transmediality in art, experience of landscape, digital approaches to exhibitions, and other themes. The first of these exhibitions is planned for the early autumn at SOAS in the University of London, the School of Oriental and Asiatic and African Studies at the University of London in the library. And we are actively looking for other venues, hint, hint. So if you know of anybody locally who might be interested, we would be delighted to discuss it further. While each of these presentations stands on its own, we also see them as overlapping and in dialogue with one another, just as the different forms of the mountain estate, physical, represented, remembered, and imagined, were in the 18th century. Just as it was for the emperor, audience is also central to our conception of the project. Although the 3 presentations address different constituencies, to borrow Pamela Crossley's expression, With distinct user journeys or reader experiences, they share an intention of combining scholarly argument about experience and medium with a reach beyond academic audiences to educational and public engagement. All models are wrong, but some are useful. This is the conclusion. In 1976, the statistician George Box quipped, quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." He continues, quote, "Now it would be very remarkable if any system existing in the real world could be exactly represented by any simple model. However, cunningly chosen parsimonious models often do provide remarkably useful approximations. For such a model, there is no need to ask the question, is the model true? If truth is to be the whole truth, the answer must be no. The only question of interest is the model illuminating and useful?" The virtual mountain estate seeks, above all, to model something that is ephemeral and impressionistic in a form that allows new modes of approach and understanding. It does so in a historiographic context that is doubly marginalized. Already an era of significant source scarcity, the Kangxi period offers little in the way of surviving materials describing Bishu shanzhuang, its architecture and furnishings, or even its use over the course of the last 20 years of the emperor's reign. By carefully defining our art historical object in questions, what are we modeling? What are we asking? And what do we need in order to address these questions? We are able to draw on existing sources, broaden our source pool, and offer a critical model that is, in Box's terms, illuminating and useful. The second form of marginalization addressed by the project is that of the non-West, both in the humanities generally and the digital humanities more particularly. Our collective sense of what constitutes experience, indeed our collective sense of the senses, is, as with so many things in the contemporary world, largely dependent on Western cum global cultural norms. This is particularly visible in the context of digital tools and environments, which are coded according to dominant global understandings of space, perception, and narrative. While we might obviously invoke Orientalist critiques of games such as Assassin's Creed in support of this argument, a more trenchant example might be the near-exclusive reliance on linear perspective in most game engines, making certain types of culturally situated vision the effective default in 3D environments. This, by the way, has changed some over time as rare tools have emerged that allow you to mess around with normal Cartesian space, but they remain quite the exception. By centering subjective experience of a specific landscape and through a specific source in early 18th century China in the manner that it does, the virtual mountain estate seeks to historicize and particularize understandings of the past in ways that have long been obscured in academic and popular discourses. As such, we might well close today by inverting Box's axiom to say that while models cannot tell us the whole truth, they sometimes contain truths that are partial or elusive, but nonetheless essential, ones, moreover, that can be told uniquely through the model. Historians have developed numerous approaches over time to address such penumbra. Social history and postcolonial studies both have their roots in similar motivations. So too does Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation. While I would not compare the experience of an imperial garden to that of slavery in any way, Hartman's work offers powerful inspiration in uncovering hidden histories, stories that need to be explored despite, or as a means for addressing, the absence of sources or predominant historical norms. The virtual mountain estate aspires to this by helping to decenter histories of landscape and experience in a rapidly evolving technological and cultural environment. Thank you very much. And I will attempt to stop sharing so I can see you all again.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was a really, tremendous presentation. Really wonderful sort of interleaving of different, elements of art history and digital humanities, and obviously a fascinating topic. And I'm always very pleased to see the Jesuit painters of the Qing court. Or the Jesuit, I mean, they were much more than painters. The Jesuit polymaths at the Jesuit at the Qing court making an appearance. That's always very Very interesting to me. The way things normally work is we invite students to type their questions in the chat, and so students you could start typing, and while you're doing that, maybe I'll ask a couple of sort of opening questions. The first one is a sort of practical one. So you mentioned. This paper will be published soon. Is there a venue
Yeah.
or?
Yeah, so the primary venue will be a web publication published by Power Publications at the University of Sydney, which is now has shifted mostly, I think, from being a traditional print book publisher, though they still do some of that,
Mm,
to building bespoke digital publications, born digital publications for projects particularly relating, though not exclusively relating to Asia.
mm,
And so that will include, as I mentioned, I think a videos of the models that you will be able to experience, much like the one I showed you today. They won't be fully
mm,
interactive because of technological limitations, as
mm.
well as a series of essays, lesson plans for teaching, as well as the data sets, the ontology, a whole variety of other things.
Okay.
We are finishing the text for that now. We have the wireframes. We are hoping to go into production later in the year once the texts clear the second round of peer review. Then
Mm.
there'll be this little print book that will happen
After
sometime
that.
after,
Yeah.
and it may take a little while. And then, as I say, a series of exhibitions. We have previously, Hedron and I have previously published a short article on the sort of thinking behind this, which I didn't talk about today, which is
Mm,
called X sheds, which is short for experience sheds. That is a approach to trying to think about historical experience digitally that derives from the idea of view sheds, which is a landscape term, and also, as it turns
mm,
out, a GIS term
mm.
for what you can see from a particular vantage point. And so we
Okay.
talk about X sheds or experience sheds as what you can experience from a vantage point. And we have published and are continuing to publish on that idea as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Maybe one more thing before we move on to the student questions. So, when your sort of opening salvo was to do with, how can we reconstruct experience, this sort of seemingly very ephemeral thing. It made me think of sort of Baxendale's period I, and I was thinking, oh, is there a sort of
Mm,
a period experience? And then sort of as the talk went on, you sort of explained, who's through whose eyes, to some extent, we're seeing things. We're being invited
mhm.
by the emperor, I guess. That's not maybe quite whose eyes it is, but we're invited by the emperor, and I use that text, I think, very very effectively. It struck me. So you were using the Chinese text. There's also a Manchu version.
There is also a Manchu version, and we have discussed at times. The intention is that the VRs and the website will be um, toggleable between English and Chinese. That
Mm,
all the English text will also, you can, if you're a Chinese reading user, you can switch to Chinese text.
yeah.
And we have also talked not about translating it all into Manchu, but
Uh,
about making the Manchu text available as an alternative. But
yes.
at the moment, there doesn't exist, insofar as I know, a complete translation of the Manchu poems. And my Manchu is extraordinarily rudimentary and not up to
Okay.
that task.
Okay.
And so I have at various times attempted to enlist colleagues in the translation of that. But the feeling that I have, well, I shouldn't say that. I think that the Manchu text would naturally bring a different tone to the experience.
Yes.
But I couldn't say what it would be exactly.
Yes. Yes.
Was that your
No.
question, or sorry, did I cut off your
Yes,
question
yes, yes. Yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah,
Manchu?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. No, I was just going to say yes. I mean, there are all these debates. I guess there's a traditional view of these texts that they're to some extent, mere translations, and then there's, I guess, the sort of the more modern view that says, well, some are sort of translations are maybe less interesting, but some are sort of quite interesting translations and take and present things in a very different light. Um,
And I think that my Manchu is certainly not up to the task of drawing out the distinct poetics of the two. But
mm,
if someone out there is interested in that project, as a thesis or whatever, and would like to come on to do that, we would be really keen to expand to include the Manchu because I think that's an important question.
yeah. Great. So maybe we can move on to the student questions. I see we have three at the moment in the
And
chat.
I have a couple by private message as well.
Oh, great. Okay, okay. Where would you like to start?
Oh, anywhere you like. I haven't read them.
Okay, maybe we'll start with one of the public ones, and then we can
Yeah.
maybe move on to ones that were sent to you privately. So, this is an interesting question. Thank you, Professor Whiteman, for this wonderful talk. I'm really curious about the aspects beyond the visual. As the
Mm.
project seems to foreground multisensory experience is central to how historical landscapes were perceived. I'm curious how dimensions like sounds, smell, or seasonal atmospheric changes were operationalized in practice. I think you spoke a little bit about this, but maybe you can speak a bit
Yeah.
more.
So, Chungsa, this is a really good question. And not being the technical person, I'm not the ideal person to answer this question, at least in a technical way. But you're absolutely right. This is something that we struggled with, that VR and digital media in general do the visual and the oral, which is say what you can hear, the best. And like there's no smellorator or whatever in VR. You can't bring out the smell of flowers, nor can you cause, though there are, this may be changing, nor can you cause me to feel directly the sensation of wind on my skin, for instance. However, there is a great deal about, as I understand it, about the way we perceive the environment. For instance, we know, for instance, that like taste and smell go really well together, right? You can't taste anything when you have a cold because your nose doesn't work. And that is also true of how, for instance, to a degree, of how we, for instance, feel things. And so while we can't make you feel a breeze, we can cause the trees to move. We can cause the flowers to move. We can put waves on the water surface. And that all contributes to your awareness that coupled with what you've read, that there is
Mm.
a breeze. Similarly, we can't do anything about smells, really, except tell you in the text that there is supposed to be a fragrance. We chose poems
Mm.
that we chose poems for a variety of criteria, one of which was that the buildings were no longer extant. So we thought there was a real opportunity to rebuild, to reimagine something that wasn't there. But also ones that depended primarily on sight and sound as their primary stimuli. We avoided, for instance, the poem that I opened with that required some other sense, or the poems that have fragrance as a central issue. We didn't choose that because we knew there was no way we could model the fragrance. But that is for sure a limitation of this. And the other thing that this set of poems is very dependent on as sources is, of course, literary knowledge. And if we do a future iteration of the project, which we hope to get funding to do, we will probably aim to switch to texts that are less dependent on the mnemonic and on the intellectual. Because while it's been a very interesting process to sort of feed the poems to the viewer, things that are more directly related with vision and sound work, I think, better.
Mm. Wonderful. So we have quite a few more questions popping up here.
Okay,
Um,
I'll be quicker.
No. That was wonderful. So interesting. So maybe we can jump to Oscar Chow's question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Whiteman, for the wonderful talk. I would like to ask something related to the process of remediating 18th century woodblock illustrations and text into a 3D soundscape and visual environment. What was the most surprising historical detail that only became apparent once it was spatialized in XR, which might have been invisible in traditional 2D distant reading?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, for me, I think that there are a few things. One is that we I've always imagined that at least one audience for the 36 views was people who had been there and who would therefore correlate their memory of the space with their reading of when they read the text, right? They read the text and they sort of think back to that. And maybe that's partially because I've been there so many times. And even though I've never been in these buildings, I know the site extremely well, at least as it exists in its current form. But nevertheless, being in a building, coming out to a particular environment and visualizing the clouds, for instance, the floating reflection of the moon, the opportunity to sort of test certain qualities of spatial experience. I've written a lot about, for instance, the idea of foreshortening in the experience of Chinese gardens. The idea that, for instance, the illusion of space, that you probably all know that Chinese gardens work heavily on visual play that allows small spaces to appear big. If you just sort of block out what's around, in the background or in your peripheral vision, then this small little field of golden flowers suddenly appears like a giant area, acres and acres. The opportunity to experience that in a model was very stimulating. And then, as I mentioned, I think the other was very strongly the sound, and particularly the music, the oral quality of the poetry, and particularly the performance of the song was quite striking for me. The buildings are a little bit hard to predict. I mean, I think that we've reconstructed them very carefully. But for instance, there's a project right now at Qing, I guess, that has worked very closely on heavy archivally based reconstruction of the buildings at Bishu Shanzhuang, including the ones that we are working on. And ours are not, according to them, ours are not precisely accurate. I haven't delved too deeply into that. I think in some cases they're looking at Qianlong reconstructions of the building rather than our efforts to reconstruct. But our reconstruction of the buildings is limited to the sources that we had, which were primarily the prints and reasoned inference based on archival documents. And so although there is a certain quality to the experience of being in the buildings that is quite striking, I think there is also a sort of inverse answer to your question, Oscar, which is what was very instructive about building these models was also seeing their limitations, was facing up to and understanding the places that I wasn't gonna sort of own that. There are a couple of questions that ask about accuracy, which maybe we'll come to later. And it's very important to sort of recognize the places that this model does things. It's useful in these areas and it's not so useful in other areas. And we see that as okay.
Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe just add, I presume there's some element of environmental history here, right? Because Hebei, I guess in the second half of the 20th century was industrial. I don't know how industrial it is now. That would
Pretty
I
industrial now.
Okay, still pretty industrial. Okay, all right.
Though,
And
yeah,
and
yeah.
that presumably changes certain elements of the environment and visibility and all sorts of things like that, right?
Yeah, it does. And actually, the original plan when we started building these models was that we would attempt to model the entire garden, which is just insane, and that we would use the three-dimensional model to do things like that, to try to think about forestation and deforestation, not so much deforestation in a broad way, but how views were constructed, what view sheds looked like, what we could infer about where buildings were placed, and what their intended scenic sort of basin or view shed was supposed to be. We moved away from that, but I think there absolutely are elements like that. We depended, and this gets a little bit to the next question, we depended on the prints and one or a couple of paintings one from the Kangxi era in particular, and then some from the Qianlong era, to sort of make approximations of things like tree cover. But we, outside of the immediate surroundings of the buildings that we were working on, those are very, very rough approximations. And so we looked for stock, for instance, we didn't model our own trees in distant trees. We didn't model our own trees. We looked for stock trees in sort of GitHub repositories, and that we thought looked basically like what we wanted, and we used those. Because there were limitations to our resources. This whole thing is done on a shoestring. And so we decided that having exactly the right species of tree was not the central art historical question. So we didn't worry about it too much.
Makes sense.
Do you want to keep going? Oh, gosh, there are so many questions.
Yes, yeah. So there was a question and a next question you had in mind. What was
Oh,
that?
well, Jimmy Hui asked, I would like to know if there are only very few physical or literary references to an architecture. How would researchers try to rebuild the landscape? So, Jimmy, that's exactly right. There are very, very few. And the answer in part was that for the book that that Professor McManus mentioned earlier, I had built a sort of a topographic ground plan for the site, and we extrapolated that into 3 dimensions. That gave us some sense of where it is, but of course the landscape has changed, not only in terms of where the trees are, but there's where Xiling Chengxia there is now a giant bridge that was put in for tourists. Understanding exactly how the shoreline was before that bridge existed is not within my capacity, maybe not within anybody's. So there's only so much you can do. We worked very closely with the prints as sources for the buildings. In this case, the modularity of Chinese architecture is a great help. We can, based on a print, we can at least infer the rough construction of the building, the shape, where the pillars must be, stuff like this. But for instance, that staircase that we went down in the model, we have no idea where that staircase was in reality, at least based on sources that I have access to. And so what we did was we built the building, and then we went inside and we said, okay, so the staircase is a surprise. You can't see it when you first walk in. Where could a staircase be located that it would go downstairs where you wouldn't necessarily see it the second you walked in? And the answer we thought was immediately to one side or the other. We happened to put it to the right. It probably could have gone to the left. I can't remember why it didn't go to the left. But do we know that's correct? No. But the important thing here, again, gets to what the art historical question is for us. The art historical question is, how do we model a key thing that the emperor apparently wants you to know, which is that you don't realize that the building is 2 stories until you see a staircase taking you somewhere else. That's the important issue. The precise location of that staircase is not, it's an important question for certain scholarship that's invested in the reconstruction of the building. But the precise reconstruction of the building is not what we are invested in. So what we're invested in is the experience. For that, the staircase's location serves its function. You're surprised, great. Again, the same is said about the interior decoration. We don't know the precise table that was there, the precise throne. But that's not the central art historical question. We need furniture to create a space that is coherent and convincing for the experience. But then they just become a sort of mise en scène, a sort of series of stage props. Which precise one, so long as they're plausible, is not critical to us. Others may disagree with that approach, but that's the approach that we took.
Right. You said you had some questions that have been sent to you privately.
Yes, let's see if we haven't already covered them. Feng asks, how does the use of XR and 3D modeling balance between scholarly accuracy and the intentional embrace of multivalence, especially when reconstructing the sensory and atmospheric dimensions of Bishu shanzhuang? I think maybe I've sort of answered that question, I hope, which is to say that we try to put scholarly accuracy in giant scare quotes or very, very carefully. Accuracy is not something that we can, that either we can attain or that really that we're trying to pursue. I would say the one thing that we're really trying to do is because sometimes people say to me, I have heard a number of times, the models are too accurate. They're too shiny. They're too new. Like they look too real. They're not too accurate. They look too real. And they're sort of in that they are sort of dishonest. But the answer to that is remember that we're not trying to model reality in any sort of objective sense. What we're trying to do is model the emperor's rhetoric, the emperor's presentation. So the fact that the models look very shiny and new and very fancy, that's consistent with the imperial rhetoric, which is that this is an important, fancy place. And in that sense, we try to focus on what we know and then create this plausible fiction around it so that the whole is there, but that the plausible fiction simply supports the central thing that we're trying to model, which is the text. I think that also Eunice Mock asks, how do you balance scholarly rigor with open-ended interpretation when building the virtual mountain estate? When different sources or user expectations conflict, who decides what to model? And could this process unintentionally create a new virtual canon that limits rather than expands how we imagine historical landscapes? I mean, I think, Eunice, I've answered sort of the first half of that question. Maybe you might disagree. I think that the virtual canon, the idea that the model, that all models, that all immersive environments make sort of truth claims, that they are, that one of the risks of not only immersive stuff and interactive stuff, but in general the visual is that it tends to be very convincing. And thus we see that in the problem of, like, now we all know, we look at images that are AI produced and we think, is this real or is this AI? Well, because as it gets better and better, it's very quickly becomes quite convincing. I think the way we try to do that is by hopefully giving talks like, but then writing in the way that I'm trying to do today, which is very extensively about the limitations, the thought process, the sort of careful qualities of this process, and being very clear about what we think it does and the things that it doesn't do. And I'm not saying that you or any of you are asking this question, but what I have in the past sometimes said when people say, well, what about this? Why, how can you defend this? I say, I don't need to defend this because I never suggested that it was going to do that. I only suggested it was going to do this other thing. And so you can take me to task for whether or not I do that. But this other thing I know that I'm not going to do. And thus I leave, I'm very grateful for projects like the Tsinghua Architecture Project, but we don't pretend to do that type of work. If you see, I hope that helps. No one, I don't feel like anyone here is accusing me of that. I'm just sort of trying to lay out this sort of distinction in the art historical question. Now those are the two questions I think I had privately.
Oh, great.
So we can go further down. If we have time, we can do more.
Yeah. So
we maybe don't have time. I don't know.
Yeah. I think yeah, we have about 2 minutes. So if there's any question you want to answer, otherwise I have a sort of final question as well.
Oh, well, please. If you can send me the chat, I'm sorry. There are a lot of really, really thoughtful questions here, but I wouldn't know where to start with them.
Okay. All right. I can
Yeah.
I can send you, yeah, I think I get a text file of the
please.
chat when I close things. So yeah, I'll try and send that to you. Wonderful. Yes. So maybe as a sort of final question, we can ask, this project is, I guess, nearing completion.
Yes.
And so are you going to continue in this same vein, or are you going to embark on new directions?
Well, that's an interesting question. There is some conversation about continuing in the same vein and developing X-sheds further. And I happen by coincidence to have a number of students who are working on various what I would call, I don't know anybody else would, documentary painting of the Qing court. So things like the Kangxi and Qianlong Emperor's birthday scrolls, or the Southern Tour scrolls, or the sericulture scrolls, things like this that show real events, that visually document real events. And we're particularly interested in ones that show festivals of various types around the Empress Dowager's or the Emperor's birthday, or that show rituals. And so we have talked about continuing this project when we finish this into a sort of phase 2 or a next version, in which in part we've learned so much about what this can and can't do along the way. And some of the questions you're asking, which are great questions, are reflections of the limitations of the sources, which is to say that if we had known when we started where we were going to end up, we might have chosen a different source material than the source material that we chose. But we didn't. We only learned about what this can and can't do as we grappled with the material that we have. So it is possible that we will make another choice and do a Xsheds version 2. And then otherwise, I am also, which I suppose is partially what you're asking, am currently writing a book, or researching, not doing much writing, but researching a book on the history of Chinese maps, and on mapping as a process of visualization or visualizing spatial imaginaries in early modern and modern China. And that's sort of in its middle phases right at the moment.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So
Well,
we'll see which dominates my attention in the coming.
Yes, exactly. Well, when you come to Hong Kong, yeah, I'm sure you'll be able to make use of. There's some quite notable map collections here. I know at HKUST has a big one. I know that.
For sure they do, and I plan on being there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Great. So it's just turned 5:30 here. So this is this is when we, I guess, turn into a pumpkin for our seminar
Indeed.
here. Yeah, I guess all that remains for us to do is to collectively and virtually thank our speaker for the really very inspiring presentation. A really great way to finish off this term 2 of the Digital Humanities Talk series at the RAH. We look forward to seeing you all next term for another series of talks in digital humanities across various subfields. I hope you all have a good summer. So thanks again so much, Stephen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.